All right, all right. Just starting some stuff up. Doing a little sound check real fast. All right, so before we start, because we are always going to get into some deep stuff when we set a day like this. So let's say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, all right. So let's first have a conversation about the biblical narrative. So I'm going to open up a paint tool. So my first thing that I want to address today, I want to consciously give the understanding on how the biblical narrative makes sense for illustration of the creation, right? And some people would say, the biblical narrative doesn't talk about creation. It doesn't talk about those type of things. It doesn't talk about science and all those things. That's not what the biblical narrative is talking about. So we're going to kind of challenge that. We're going to take a look at the concept of the biblical narrative, and we're going to look at genetics and modern people today and see if when Messiah in the New Testament says, there shall come a day like the days of Noah, is he referring to a symbolic day or an actual physical day that had happened before, right? Now, is he talking about an event that's a small event? Because remember, he also says, just like in the days of Noah, right? It's also going to be his appearance. He compares his arrival in the sense of something that's has to do with the whole world. So he's reflecting to something that has to do with a long time ago, an event a long time ago. So we're going to make a two-sided chart here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a type of series, and we're going to start from the beginning, and we're going to verify the first phases of the order. Now, I already did a video on the whole thing of Genesis itself, like the creation from, how he made the water, he parted the waters, then he put fish, right? Remember, before there was man, there was fish, just like in creation, right? Like in the sense of even the creation of the world, and as an evidence of the scientific academic papers of creation, how we know that the world was a water world, and all of a sudden we had a growth of different fish, and then birds and all those things, and then later on mammals, right? Just like the biblical narrative. All of it makes sense. But we want to also prove something interesting that changes during the time of the flood, right? There's a different change that's going to happen during the time of the flood that we're going to take a note of. So this is going to be a major summary. So, and then we're going to get in between of the details of the change of individuals like Seth. So we're going to just put down some names here. I'm going to put down some names on here. So classic individuals. And we need a design here. We have a family tree, and we needed to have Cain and Seth so that we can see a full picture, because we need to have pretty much a full tree of Adam and Eve and Cain and Seth and all that, right? So we need a full tree. So let's see what we got here. We just need something simple. So let's go to, we could put Adam's family tree. We probably don't need to add that. Let's see. We can just find one real quick on here. Okay. This one we don't want to get anything extra. We just want the simple basis of it all, right? And we're gonna kind of make it simple, like with it. So this is gonna be after Noah, because a lot of people when they look at these genetics, they start off with Noah. Now, if you want to understand the real understanding of creation and the Bible, we got to look at the creation as a whole, right? One of the biggest things also of the beginning, actually, just the reason why I'm doing this, because I heard someone say this. I heard an atheist say this, and he said, he tried to mock the Bible and saying, didn't the Bible say that humans came from dirt? And you think about it, it's like, wait a second. If we look at the Big Bang idea, right? Don't also humans in all life would come from dirt, right? Out of the Big Bang, everything was all hot. Then all of a sudden, things cooled down, right? There was no life at that time. Then all of a sudden, there was life. This one's a nice one. We'll just go with this one. This one's a nice one. This one's a nice one. Okay, so we'll use this one. So, what happened in the beginning, right? We can summarize it. In fact, let me make sure I have the Bible open too, because go to 2, because we would need this just for if we need to reference it. But we got it all in us. So I'm just gonna go to, I don't know, English KJV, right? I don't mind other translations like the NASV and all that stuff when but I do like how the KJV sounds. All right, so let me point out something where it talks about the beginning of the creation. One of the first and most important things is that obviously humans wasn't the first of the creations, right? Just like we know in academic creation, we know that humans weren't first; humans were later. So that's going to be also important for how the creation goes. But we're gonna start off with Adam. So what do we know already of Adam? And what do we also know academically of the creation of a living being, right? A lot of people would assume a evolution process, right? It starts off as this little thing that all of a sudden becomes this complex thing. But no matter what, we know that when we get humans, and one of the biggest connections of humans, right? When we look at mammals, right? Warm-blooded creatures, warm-blooded beings, right? There's a major difference between warm-blooded beings and cold-blooded beings, right? A lot of cold-blooded beings were made on day 5. Remember, humans were made on day 6 based on the biblical narrative. But on day 5 were a lot of cold-blooded things like fish, birds, and stuff like that, right? Then the next day was mammals, right? Land animals and things like that. It's a major difference between that blood that's made on those 2 different days. But on the same day where animals, land animals, right, mammals and stuff, and humans were made, which these mammals are very similar, right? When you look at them, you find very close similarities between these warm-blooded creatures made on the same day, right? By one creator, showing a common design from one creator. These things are very relevant to creation and understanding of how the order is set. Now let's take an understanding that we already understand. There had to be, as even in academic understanding, there has to be an Adam. Now, when I say an Adam, there has to be a first man. There has to be a beginning of men, right? And we even know that in science. We have pointed this out before, right? If you go to the earliest lineage of people, right, of Y DNA, some people would say it's A00, that's Y DNA Adam. But if you go to any like geneticist or scholar and go deep into it, there's an ancestor to it that's deeper than that. The reason why that's important, because let me open up one more note here. The reason why that's important is because the first thing before you start looking for trying to connect the biblical narrative to Ham, Shem, and Japheth and all that, the first thing you got to verify is the beginning legend. Now, when I say the beginning legend, that means how it's structured. what you're seeing right here in the biblical tale, when it's telling you these generations, these are actually what is called ancestral nodes. So Adam would be your ultimate root or your ultimate ancestral node. So on any chart, whenever you have a root, it would be your Y chromosome atom, Y chromosomal atom. So, and what's important about this Y chromosomal atom is that it's not 800, it's deeper than 800. But what it links, you have to understand what exactly it links. It links every human being, every human creature that ever lived, ever existed, would link to this ultimate atom. That's important. That means that every human that ever lived, scientifically, as the biblical narrative says, would link to one human, would link to one ultimate node, one ultimate human being, right? They do a lot of talk on it. They talk a lot of how it works and everything, how the blending of it is. We had talked about this line as well. We found it in Spain, El Chadran, and we had talked about how it links together the Neanderthals and all basically ancient humanoids, pretty much. And it will be linked to a ultimate atom, which is called Y-MRCA, or basically your Y chromosomal atom. We had talked about this when we had talked about pretty much the out of Africa concept versus the out of Eurasia concept, because remember what happens right after the flood. We're going to talk about that. We'll even talk about the science behind it, behind the evidence. Any questions? I'm looking on my screen. You drop any questions, we'll touch on that. So we're starting off with Adam. Is Adam real? Yes. Is Eve real? Absolutely. So we also have an Eve, a mitochondria Eve. Now, many people who know the understanding behind this already know that many people who point to mitochondria Eve, they'll point to L0. But they have been constructing a mtDNA table, a very important mtDNA table that is being used, like how there's Y tree and everything. I'll talk about that a little later on because I want to do a live on how the mtDNA is structured. There actually is a line deeper than L0. Now, Wiki doesn't have that. There's a couple different sources to go into that will go into actually the ancestor of L0. For example, just to point something out, I put the link because I don't know how hard or easy it is to find this link. So I'm going to go to where I gave the source of that. So I put this link in one of the videos right here. So I'm trying to make this. Just going to pause that. And it's in the description. And let me just go to something here. So it's Y tree. They're doing a reconstruction. They're building the mtDNA tree. Now, let me show you what I mean. Here's L0. Now, notice what doesn't descend from L0. Every other line. So every other line doesn't descend from L0. But L0 comes from an ultimate L node. Now, what's interesting is it's not the ultimate root. Because if we go back, there is a lineage that will combine this line, that will combine, as it says, Neanderthals and modern humans. And then there's also a different one that combines a type of lineages like the Denisovans. Now, this is where it gets kind of important to understand that the modern human and Neanderthal mixture, that's what basically, when you look at some studies that say that people have a quote unquote autosomal connection to like Neanderthals or stuff like that, this is actually what they start to check. It's basically ancient lineage that goes back beyond the time of the flood. Now, I'm going to show you where is that cutoff of these lines, of the line between modern humans or humans after the flood versus humans before the flood or ancient humans, right? Which is also evident on the Y chromosome of humans or in the mtDNA. And remember, this is what's also interesting. There was a bottleneck. This is what's important to know about. What was Noah called? Let me actually point this out in the Bible because I'm gonna point something out that's very important to know about. Right before the flood, we're gonna look at also the descendants, and then we're gonna get to the time of Noah and point out something that's very important to know about Noah. Now, remember, by the time of Noah, he had many different brothers and sisters, many different descendants. Cain had a family. Others had big, massive families at that time. By that time. Right, this is a generations down, like thousands of generations down, or almost 1,500 generations down, and that's a lot of generations that can produce in a short time. Now, first thing we got to point out, after the flood, what did Noah become? Because there's something important to know about this. Now, I have pointed this out as we go over these things. You got to be careful on certain time frames. But one thing is important about what happens with Noah right after the flood. So remember the sign of the rainbow. What does it tell them? Be fruitful and fill up the earth, right? Right here where it says to them, right? The whole earth was spread. It says to his children, the whole earth was spread and everything. But notice something important about Noah. Watch what it says here. And Noah began to be a husbandman. Now, this is very important. This lets us know that he is doing farming, right? Farming is introduced in the Neolithic time frame, and it says he planted a vineyard. Now, before we get to this, before we get to his farming and everything, we're going to verify that farming has to come in by the time of Noah. Now, what's interesting is academically, farming doesn't happen until a little bit later if we're looking at origins of humans. So we know that early on they weren't doing a lot of farming. So this is very special that basically Noah started to do, and that he started having this vineyard. Now, we don't really know if there was any farmers before him, but we know that by him and his introduction, we know that farming would begin with him, and then an expansion would happen with this type of farming culture. We're going to keep that in mind because we're going to kind of go from Adam to Noah, and we're going to fill in that blank. So first thing we need to understand is that we got to look at the family tree on here. So how many sons? The first son that Adam had is Cain, right? And he gets with someone, right? And he has a son. And he gets with someone, and he has a son, right? And they keep having sons and sons and sons and sons and daughters, sons and daughters and sons and daughters. One of the biggest things about the scripture is that the scripture constantly would tell you that they would have sons and daughters, right? Before we even get there, right? And then there's Seth, right? Because remember, Cain killed Abel because Cain was born first, then Abel was born. We don't know if Abel had any kids, but we know Abel was old enough to raise up animals. So if Abel was old enough to raise up animals, he could have had a whole family, right? So that can also expand to the increase of those things. But we don't know if he did. But we know that Cain had killed Abel, and Cain had continued having a family. Seth was born later on. So the first children was Cain, Abel, and Seth. And Seth also would be an individual that would have his own children. Now, also, Adam had other sons and daughters, right? The scripture tells us that Adam had sons and daughters. What would that mean if he had other sons and daughters? Let's go to also just to verify that where that's said, right? And then we'll go back to Genesis 9, because it's important to know that some of the parts that seem boring in the Bible, like the generations, are actually very detailed on purpose so that it can be verified as you go about it if he was connected with the reality of the thing, right? As it says right here, male and female created he them and blessed them. He called their name Adam in the day that they were created, right? And see, Adam, he had children after his likeness and everything. He had Seth and all that. And then you can see right here, and all the days of Adam, you can see right here. Let's read right here. And the days of Adam after he begotten Seth. So after he begotten Seth, he lived a long time. And it said, and he begat sons and daughters. So that's important. So we know that others have sons and daughters. Many others have sons and daughters, and they have sons and daughters. So let's go back over here. So we already know from the get-go that there's going to be separations. Now, notice how we would have some archaic names. Now, don't let those archaic names throw you off from the genetic information. In fact, a lot of people, when they think of Neanderthals and Denisovans, they think them to be like different type of humans, not connected to us. But really, if you really look at the genetic information, they're human, but they're just ancient human. That's why they call them archaic human, or basically ancient humans, right? That's very important to know that the ancient humans would have genetic ties to people today. Now, with that said, let me point out something that's kind of interesting about this. So we went very deep into the understanding of basically the connection of Neanderthal and modern humans, and something rang a bell that was important to know about. Now, what was one of the most important things to know right before the flood, that the earth was filled. So what we're looking for is a whole culture of people that had to be extinct, completely wiped out, and yet we had to see the earth filled with a culture that wasn't modern humans, meaning groups of people that would be a line of groups that exist today that would show that they went through a type of bottleneck, right? A type of bottleneck. So what do I mean by a bottleneck? So let me first point out something, this interesting study that came out just recently, 2020, on some of the first actual genetic comparisons of modern humans and Neanderthals. And they got some of some of the Neanderthals we had talked about, like El Shadron, which is somewhere on here, maybe El Shadron. Look closer. Yeah, right there. Right there, El Shadron. And that's in Spain. So that, and we have verified those were ancient humans. You got Denisovans on here, right? They got Neanderthals and Denisovans. And what they did a comparison at the genetic variation in it. Now, what's interesting about that is that I have pointed this out before, that in the Neolithic time frame, there was a bottleneck. What do I mean by that? I'm gonna show you a conversation I had on Discord on a channel that I kind of help out a little bit with. And I want to show you what we kind of had a conversation on. And I think it's kind of interesting. So let me just go to that. And I'm also going to show a piece of evidence that's not often talked about that does show us that there was a catastrophic flood and it left behind some pieces that tells us a very important story. So we're going to kind of go about that very carefully. All right. Let me just go up here. All right. So the piece of evidence that I want you to know about is something called an escarpment. So let me first point this out before we dive in. So first I was pointing out what is escarpment is. So an escarpment, long story short, this is going to be basically some stuff that was left behind after the flood. But what they are is just evidence of basically erosion. It's like a dramatic change of landmass. And a lot of times it's by water. A lot of times it actually happens by water. Well, let me just show a little bit of something here. All right. So you see this thing right here? So what actually causes this thing right here? What actually causes this effect? What actually causes this, right? It's actually really interesting when you go a little more deeper into it, when you find out how old these landscapes are. So here's a little bit of it. Escarpments are pretty much everywhere, but let me read you a little interesting highlight that I think is kind of interesting. So this is going to be basically, it's going to be reading some interesting information. We're going to talk about coastal escarpment. So coastal great escarpments caused by flood runoff. Now, what do I mean that this is a great piece of evidence of the flood? Because escarpment, one of the interesting thing about the escarpment is that it also is usually going to be evident of massive water, the effects of massive water, right? What do I mean by that? So let me show you what we actually would see from an escarpment, just to get a little idea of what's going on. So we got them in different places. We got them in South Africa. We got them in Australia. We got them all in America, right? There's that little video right here. I'm also going to show something on trace. We're going to have a conversation when we get to the splits of Ham, Shem, and Japheth and all that. But here is an escarpment, right? This is kind of like an example here. So all over America, right? Australia, India, Brazil, right? We got them pretty much everywhere, right? We got them a lot of different places. And we actually know something very interesting from them. This is actually what we know. Long story short, we know that there has to be a large body of water on top of it. As the water moved on it, it would actually cause the type of dirt erosion to happen that would cause a type of cliff, a giant fall cliff that basically would show itself later on, as we see later today, just like some of the what you see here is actually was water. As you can see the water down there, the water was high enough up here, basically building these sidewalls, right? So that's very important to know about, right? That we have those evidences all over the world, right? We have those pieces of evidence all over the world. So we know that was a catastrophic event that had happened that left these pieces of landscape left. Now we can go a little more deeper into it, but let me go a little more into why these things are important, right? So we just talked a little bit about that of the escarpments and everything, but they happen. What happened is they start to happen. Some people don't know how long ago they were and stuff. Some look like they're millions of years old and stuff like that. But that's why we talk about the flood and how the water erosion actually causes massive years, right? We have talked about these things on how these things work and everything. Why water actually is the reason for these layers and stuff like that. That's very important. So it's very important to know about water, right? We had talked about it with all these escarpments in Saudi Arabia and everything. We talked about how Saudi Arabia was flooded completely underwater. We had evidence of that when it was underwater and everything, right? That was something that was very interesting and important to know about. We know that because when we look in the flood, we know a couple different things. I'm just going to point out something that's kind of important to know about. The flood obviously would be an event that happened when the whole world was covered with water. What else would be wiped out? Animals and humans. So what would that show us? A giant bottleneck on animals and humans. So that's going to be very important to kind of find if we can find a genetic bottleneck of animals and humans, right? Now, what we had seen after a lot of massive water, we've seen an ice age happen, right? Now, let me put some things on the chart here so that we can put this down. So we already seen, right? On this side, we're going to basically put, for just to clarify it, everything that's going to be from the Bible is here, right? And anything that's from, let's say, a source, right? An external source. Anything from an external source, we'll put here, right? So we know that we had a Adam, right? In the Bible, we had an Adam, and we had an Eve. And let me actually make this smaller. So we had an Adam, and we had an Eve, and they had sons. So he had sons and daughters, right? So they have sons and daughters. And one of the main snips, one of the main groups we were told about, one of the main ones we were told about was Cain, and the other one that survived, Seth. So those are going to be the main ones that we're going to have to look at. Those are going to be before. Right? It's going to be in between the flood, and it's going to be after. So Adam, Cain, Seth to Noah. This is often Y-DNA, Adam and Eve. Right? There's a Y-DNA, Adam and Eve, right? And many nodes, right? Nodes that make many clades, right? Now, I already remember I pointed that out before, node and a clade and all that, all those things and whatnot, because that's important to know real fast. Let's just point out just for the sake of the live, right? Node versus clade, right? Because a node, those will be the roots, and in the clade, those will be the descendants, right? So we know what is a clade. A clade is everything from the root, counting everything on the stem. So that's a clade, right? A clade is even just the stem. That's a clade, right from the node. But what's not a clade? One on another side and one on another side, but not counting basically is total node, right? You got to count, the node counts with the clade. So that means the father counts for the sons, right? Right. We don't need, right? We don't need the to connect every son from maybe like Adam. But we just, when we get to like stuff like Noah, we only need to connect clades. So that's going to be key to know about nodes and clades, the difference of nodes and clades in the root. So yes, we'll have branches, but a clade will be one family and a node would be a father. So we can also see that very depicted very clearly on the illustration of basically how those families are set based on the Bible, right? Let's take a look at that. So you can see these will count as a root. This will be your root. This will be a node here. Seth will be a node. This will be another node. These will be the clade of Cain. This will be the clade of Seth, right? And then it works its way down until it gets to the time of Noah, which is one node. So we're going to have to find that node and then those clades of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So node, each clade. So three major clades will have to be found and proven that they don't make each other, because that's how a node and a clade, a node to a clade will work. So of course, Noah should be able to make all three of these, but we should not be able to prove that Japheth can make a Hamite or a Hamite can make a Shemite. So these three, whatever lineage it is of modern humans today, every human that's living today that's not wiped out, they have to show that their lines link together but don't make each other. And we'll go over that when we go over it. But first, let's go back to that, because that's a little more I want to highlight on this that happens. Because about on the scientific scale, they say it's about 30,000 when there's like this massive extinction that happened of humans, right? And we're going to talk about the difference between Arctic humans and modern humans and everything. It's going to be kind of important to know. But this actually is one of those events that takes off. Now I'm going to point it out. There is a bottleneck that happens. I'm going to point this out real fast. All right, so paleodemographic modeling supports a population bottleneck during the Pleistocene and Heliocene transitions in Iberia. Now, Iberia, like we went over before, right? When the early lines of people had settled the earth, they settled all across the whole earth, right? So that's going to be kind of important to know about and everything, that they have filled the whole earth. But there was an event. There was an event that happened that's going to be a process, and it's going to look like a process on the genetic charts and on timely charts. It's an event called the older Dryas to the younger Dryas. Now, if you look at it carefully, it looks like a process of time. The reason why it looks like a process of time, because remember, even the biblical narrative tells you the flood was a process of time. It didn't just all of a sudden flood. It rained. That means the weather. Imagine a world that never rained at first. Because remember, it was watered by a mist, and all of a sudden it rained. And it started to throw off all the things that were set in that time. And it threw off a lot of things. And then when that happened, many things changed, right? That's going to change a lot of stuff. So let me point that out real fast. So that's why we're now pointing out the bottleneck, right? So very, very important. Very, 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 very important. Let's point it out real fast. Let's point out that bottleneck. So remember, we're doing everything academically, and I'm also going to show you when we go over it how we also verify everything with geneticists and professionals alike to verify these things. That's why if you see me talk to like atheists and stuff like that, I can get them to start agreeing to what I'm saying. Like, for example, I had a conversation with T-Jump, and we talked about the Neolithic bottleneck. He's like, yeah, you're right. That was a Neolithic bottleneck where all basically mammals, 90% of them went through basically a extinction. And that's a major important event to know about. Why? Because it's a lot of information on ancient times. It tells you rain was scarce. Rain was scarce. Now, the world would be moist. So the evidence they would find was they would find evidence of water. So they would think it would be rain because water, after the mist waters the earth, you're going to have a lot of that mist that's going to fill the earth. That's going to look like, rain at some point. So that's something to know about. But they also know that it looked like it was scarce, right? But they talk about there was pockets of rainforest and everything that survived in that time. They say also note this: the global sea level was more than 400 feet lower than it is today. That means that the ancient prehistoric world didn't have as much water in that time, right? So they didn't have that much water in that time. The water was lower. So a lot of bodies, as you can see with this ancient map here, this is a real ancient map of a design of what they think it would look like and everything. You can kind of see over here how Australia, this whole islands are connected, right? Right now, today, there's a whole like body of water here, but there's a large landmass here connecting all these. So the world was like highly connected, right? Had a lot of connections and everything. But there was also some massive ice gaps. So there was a lot of ice in certain places that would basically make it where people couldn't pass over or go over to the other side. Right. But what happened was what's important. Remember, very important to point this out at around this time. Right. They know that it says with so much of the planet's water tied up in ice. So they say most of the water was in ice. Global sea levels was more than 400 feet lower than it is today. Right. So, and I'm showing you this from like, as we always go over professional sites, that's going to give you the direct actual information, right? That's going to give you the real keys to this. Let me make sure I post this one here because this one, I don't see my posted link, which is good. I'll just copy this and grab the link to it because I do believe in keeping those receipts, citing those sources. Let me make sure I put this one on there because it might be important to do that. Real fast. So right here, I'm going to copy that. So this is what we were just talking about. So you can see what's going on there. Just talk about a little bit of the ocean. It's very important to know that it was way different back then and everything. Let me just go back over here so we can finish that highlight. I'm just going to put this right there. All right. It's going to go down. So you can see we just read that, how the water was lower. So if the water was 400 feet lower, when did the water go 400 feet higher? Think about that. Let me read you. I'm going to read you a couple of things to kind of point out a sporadical event that happens in between the Younger Dryas, between 14,000, 7,000, some event like that. But really on the biblical scale, when we put it side by side, you're going to see that it's going to make sense when you start to look at the genetics next to it. So remember, before I point this out, let me make sure I consciously point this out before I point this out, because you got to consciously know this, that genetically, as I was pointing out earlier, genetically, there is evidence that ancient humans as well as ancient animals share genetic lines that are extinct. There is not just extinct animals in the fossil record, but there is a pinpoint understanding to a extinction that happens in the Neolithic, where a massive global extinction happens, which is very important. It's also important to know that when certain events happen, like the flood and everything, water causes things to settle by weight. So that's something I had pointed out too, that when water moves and something settles lower, it doesn't automatically mean it's older. It just means it was heavier. So let me actually point something out real fast that is very important consciously. When the earth was filled with all types of people, there was a massive extinction event. And there's a widely accepted and known fact that all ancient humans, all Arctic humans, all ancient humans, right? Archaic humans, all ancient humans are extinct. Neanderthals, Denisovans, that's what they're called by name, but their genetic compound, right? There's an ancient ancestral node. Remember we was talking about Adam, right? Remember we was talking about Adam? There's an ancient connection to ancient humans and modern humans, right? That makes a massive separation. So they have an ancient node. So remember we talked about that, how the node is. They have an ancient node, but their clade, right? The clade that's here is totally separate from the modern human clade, right? If we look on paint, we got a good understanding of that we're going to have a separation of clade. So remember, Cain would be a clade and Seth will be a clade. And remember how we already verified that was Adam and Eve nodes that make many clades, right? Very important. So we will see that same understanding and a major separation. So let's actually put an idea down right here. What do we know 100%? By the science, this is the scientific name. This is what's important to know about the scientific name. Modern humans. Everyone living today is called a modern human. No one is a, even if they have a Neanderthal or Denisovan admixture, no one is technically from the Y chromosome or mtDNA 100% from a Neanderthal or a Denisovan or any Arctic human, ancient or archaic human. Any ancient human is not what we have today. So I'll also show you that real fast. To kind of show you what's important. So here's what it says. Archaics are distinguished from atomically modern humans by having thick skulls and a lot of different things and whatnot. So that's important to know that there's a difference between archaic humans, right? The ancient grouping of humans that would be ancient humans, that would be right before modern humans, versus modern humans, right? So modern humans versus archaic humans. So that's gonna be kind of important to note because that's gonna give us evidence of the events before the flood. Now, this is also important because some people, they'll try to make descendants of Noah and humans that we would say by the biblical narrative would have been around no later than the Neolithic time frame, right? Noah could not exist before the Neolithic time frame. You hear what I'm saying? He could not exist before the Neolithic time frame. Now that doesn't mean that there's no exaggerated dating in the academic papers. That's something to know. But Noah, by him being a farmer, he couldn't exist before the Neolithic time frame. That's going to be important too for extinctions. Now, remember, before Noah, you're going to have Cain and Seth. So that's something to know about the divisions that's going to happen here. So we're going to get a division of who we're going to have. So what's going to be the lines that's going to live in the time of Noah? What's going to be lines that live from the time of Noah, right? Not Cain's line, but Seth's line. So Seth is going to bring forth Noah, right? So Seth is going to bring forth Noah, and Noah is going to bring forth, right? Ham, right? Shem, and Japheth, right? So Ham, Shem, and Japheth, we'll just put it like that. Ham, Shem, and Japheth would exist at the time of the events right before the wipeout. So there's going to be a major separation between modern humans and other humans. So Ham, Shem, and Japheth is different from what? He'll be different from lines of Cain. So Cain's line would be the archaic lines. So Cain's line would be the archaic lines. So this would be pre-flood. So pre-flood, Cain. So that would be, he would be pre-flood, right? So that's something that's important to know, that Cain line had to fill the whole earth because he lived, right? So Cain line would be a different node that filled the whole earth versus Seth line that lived but was a different node that filled the whole earth. So now if Seth lived and he had descendants of Cain, descendants of Noah, if Seth had descendants of Noah and Noah had the lines that we have today, we wouldn't be surprised if we see kind of like some lines pop up at the transition right before the extinction of ancient archaic humans. So do we have evidence that modern humans will kind of be at the last phase of ancient humans, right? Yes. So we know that if we look at genetic papers, there's some interesting information that's known about some results, right? We know that ancient humans were dwelling in areas with Neanderthals and things of that sort, right? And we pointed that out before when we was talking about the Homo sapiens in Arabia and stuff. And it says where it talks about the main Neanderthal cluster and falls closer to Homo sapiens and whatnot. And we was talking about some of those things on the PCA one and PCA, a couple things like that. And we was going over, right? It was talking about how humans moving together and were interacting with these ancient humanoids until all of a sudden the ancient humanoids vanished, right? A lot of people, they have different excuses. How did they go extinct? Did the modern humans start slaying them? They did fight at some points, but was the extinction because of some this or that? But the truth is the extinction, the massive extinction that takes place is because of the flood. And we're going to kind of take a look at some of these things and whatnot. So it's going to be kind of one of those things that I think is going to be important to point out. So let me first go back down to this picture right here. So remember, we can see right here, the arrows that's going to be green and yellow on here, those going to be pre-flood. And then the arrow that's blue is going to be after the flood. So we can see on the node right there. So that would be rooting to Adam. So they don't have Adam. We don't have the genetics of Adam, but we know there is an Adam by the fact that how these nodes root together, how they all have a node that roots them together. So that's very important. And because of that connection, right? Because of that connection, we know that would lead to a separation of lines. So let's say it how it would be. So we could say that this could be like a extinction of Abel. Now, I'm not saying it is Abel, but I'm saying that it's possible it could be. We can also say that this whole line could be Cain. We can say that Cain's line had filled the whole earth early on. And we can say that all of a sudden there was a mass extinction and all modern humans today are from Noah. They're going to be from the descendants that survived after the massive extinction, right? Which we also see, again, on not just the mtDNA evidence, but on the Y-DNA evidence, which we'll take a look at. But first, getting that down, let's make sure we note that one more time before we show how this process is done. Because also when we get to the time, we're going to talk about the time of Babel. We might not do that today, but we'll get to the limits of Babel. And then we'll talk about how Babel leads to the evidence of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and stuff like that, real societies that would have a lingua franca early on, right? Because remember, the whole world was one language. But let's understand first this beginning phase. This is the most important phase that we need to understand. So academically, everything is looking really sound, right? Academically wise, right? You make sure this cord is in because I don't want no lags today. Before we move on and see how everyone's doing. All right, there might have been a flood or something, right? Indeed. That's a great question. They were closer to Adam, so wouldn't that make them genetically superior and less mutant than modern humans? That's a great question. Let's go and take a quick look at Neanderthals and Denisovans. What we found out when we look at Neanderthals, we find out some very interesting things. Specifically, one of those things is that the Neanderthals had a lot of strength. They was very strong, incredibly strong. Some of them were short, but Denisovans were very large. A lot of Denisovans were very large and stuff, but the fights that they had shows that it wasn't good for the modern humans to fight with the Neanderthals and stuff, because things weren't that good. It seems like Cain was very strong at first, that he was probably more of the aggressor in that time, because remember, he did attack Abel. So it wouldn't be surprising if he did attack individuals of Cain, because remember, there was a son, if we could recall, who killed someone. Now, who he killed, we don't know, but we know that he killed someone, one of the individuals of Cain, right? And remember, he came up and said, Cain killed someone, and he was defended, don't let no one kill me, right? So you're gonna get a episode that happens there. So we even get the name of the daughters at that time, which is interesting. But we hear that there's a murder that's still happening at that time. At this time, they're still murdering. So there's murders that's happening, and that's during the time of like Enoch and stuff like that. Not gonna say that he killed Enoch or anything like that, but that's definitely was a time when Enoch was alive and stuff like that. And if we know that Enoch was taken and everything. But Josephus, I'm just going to say this. There's an interesting writing on Josephus with Enoch, and he says that Enoch died. He says that Enoch apparently he died. And that's just something, that's just a thought. Just going to throw that thought out there. If you want to hear on that, we can go a little bit into that, how Josephus talks about Enoch dying. But apparently at that time, one of the sons of Cain killed someone. So I don't know who it was, who they killed, but there was some battles still happening at that time, which is also evident with modern humans and Neanderthals, that they were fighting. Modern humans and Neanderthals were technically going at it for a while. And that was pretty crazy that was happening, that they were end up fighting and whatnot. But they did remain together. Some had some relations and everything, and they had mix. And that mix is important because let's say one of the females of Ham, Shem, or Japheth let's say she was born from a man who was one of those fallen ones that came, the sons of man or the sons of God that came down, right? And got with some of the women. Let's say one of those women were a daughter of that one, and he got with one of those ones. That will have an autosomal connection linking ancient humans together. And it doesn't even have to be a connection like that. It could be a woman from Cain, right? A woman born from the descendants of Cain, right? So that would be also interesting connections of linking, quote unquote, modern humans to ancient humans. Now, the reason why I say that, because you see this note right here, we know that if we look at ancient humans and modern humans, we'll see a massive, right here, a massive separation for the present day non-Africans and present day groups that are in Africa with ancient groups like, you'll say, like your Neanderthals, right? So your Neanderthals, they would have a very quick separation, but for some reason, groups over here were mating with some of the groups and bringing evidence of a genetic mixture in some non-African groups. So a lot of non-African groups apparently went and mixed with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals decided to go and mix with the humans as well. Because this is the time that Neanderthals go extinct. You see how it's cut off right there, late Neanderthals. They say about 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, solidly, Neanderthals are extinct and ancient humans are extinct. There's no none of them. It's because about the time of the older to the younger Dryas, the flood events take off, right? So remember, it's raining. It's going to show those older Dryas effects of that temperature change, right? What do I mean by temperature change? What do I mean by that? Remember, all academic information. So there's a guy who connects the Y chromosome bottleneck with the younger Dryas event. Remember, we was talking about that bottleneck, that massive extinction that happens, that takes place. That's going to be something to note in. But I thought that was a very interesting question real fast to point out. maybe we'll go more into that real fast before we proceed, how those groups are mixed. Let me also point this out from this site right here, this genetic piece of information on what I mean. So this is what it is. It's literally from 2022. So literally this year, the evolutionary, now I don't believe in evolution, history of human, right? Spindle gene increases back and forth gene flow with Neanderthals. So it actually just lets us know that the humans were going back and forth and mixed. Pretty much that's what it is saying, is that the Neanderthals and humans, ancient humans and ancient people were mixing. They were basically mixing. It's the shortest way to describe that, is that there was some interactions going on that left some groups with an admixture that's evident today. That's very evident today. And that admixture is not because these aren't humans, but because these are humans, but they're ancient humans that are wiped out. And so when they look at that mixture, they see that apparently ancient humans and us aren't that far off. They just have as you know, a different genetic node. So that different node means they're a different, almost like not a different species, but a different family. It looks like a totally different family, like how Cain's family would be different from Seth's family and everything. But the Y chromosomes of them is not what we see today. So just to kind of make sense real fast, what's going on here, was it talking about, is letting you know it goes all the way to like a root split, that apparently the evidence is that the original archaic humans, the original ancient ones, came in contact with some of the modern humans. So they came in contact with some of the modern humans. And when they came in contact with some of those modern humans, they got an early admixture. That's basically what happened, is that, and the flow of that ripples through pretty much almost everyone, almost. And that's important to know because it will tie together some understanding on also how close these humans are, how actually close these humans will be. And just being careful in these years and just looking at how we can combine these things into one picture and see how these things work. That's why it's just letting us know of that mixture of these groups, right? Just to get a little more deeper into that, I'm gonna point out a source up here that I was kind of going over before, that I think, in fact, let me just point out something that I was saving earlier that I wanted to point out, because that kind of made me think about something that I was noting. Let me see if I saved the source here before we proceed, because there's a lot of events that happens with these groups. Like they fight, they go at it. There's all types of stuff that happens with these groups. We talked about how they was having wars and everything. We talked about how they was basically going at it. And that's why when people say modern humans made them go extinct, it's because there was some massive wars that they had and fought in, but that wasn't why they went extinct. The extinction wasn't because of what's the word I'm looking for? Because of humans. It was because of the flood. So the flood would actually be one of those things. But here's an example of it. I'll show you a little example of it. Let me just show this right here. There's a little example. Did Neanderthals go to war with our ancestors? So they just talk about, did they fight and everything? And they basically, long story short, is that they found out that a lot of the Neanderthals were warrior-like, right? They were very warrior-like, and they were very violent at times, and they were cannibals. And there was all types of things that apparently, why the Most High put a flood there. If you look at the history of that time, it was very horrible, right? In fact, listen to what they say right here. Right here, prehistoric warfare leaves telltale signs. A club to the head is a efficient way to kill, right? Clubs are fast, powerful, precise weapons. What do you think Cain probably used on Abel? So prehistoric Homo sapiens frequently show trauma to the skull. So what's weird is the modern humans are constantly hurt, and the Neanderthals seem like they're the ones that's hurting them. And it seemed like the modern humans were the ones that were being hurt by the Neanderthals rather than the modern humans beating the Neanderthals. But it just goes on and says, so to the Neanderthals and everything, just talks about how the Neanderthals also show a lot of broken arms and different things like that, right? They talked about one that was found in Iraq that was impaled by a spear in his chest, right? And it just talks about how there was other ones that were basically going through it. And it basically they also talk about how they found evidence of war, guerrilla styled raids and ambushes, right? So they talk about there was apparently a lot of stuff happening with modern humans, but they say the Neanderthals were resisting the modern human expansion. So they was getting evidence that the Neanderthals were fighting with the modern humans. It finally goes on and says, it is possible that the invention of the superior range weapon. So we know, and this is why we were talking about early on. Let me just point this out. The earliest evidence of war was when we were talking about the Natufian, and we have found out that they had early evidence of warfare, right? We was pointing out some of the early warfare that had happened and everything. For example, I'll just do this for a summary. Show the secondary source right there. You see what were they using? Bows and arrows. So in warfare, early warfare, they started using a lot of bows and arrows. Did you know also that was like one of the major weapons of the Israelites, bows and arrows and stuff like that? But that was one of those early things that they were using, bows and arrows. And they became kind of dominant with that. But this is apparently when the humans were losing, fighting against the Neanderthals until they made bows and arrows. And then they just say, it says, let lightly build Homo sapiens. They just talked about pretty much the stocky Neanderthals. So they took down the stocky Neanderthals from a distance using hit and run tactics. So they were hit and run. So obviously, most likely that's what made them also hunter and gatherers, right? Hunter and gatherers and everything. They became hunter and gatherers later on. But it does let us know that pretty much the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals basically were fighting for a long time, right? They basically were fighting for a long time. To kind of give a nice little summary of that is that they were going at it, right, for a while before the flood. But that's not the reason why they went extinct. But there is evidence of fighting from these groups, that the Neanderthals and the Denisovans were basically going at it for a long time. They were going at it for a long time, and that was something that, what's the word I'm looking for, caused some confrontations that may or may not have caused those groups to go extinct. So that's something that had definitely happened a long time ago. So that was something that we was pointing out. There was a lot of war at that time back then. There was a lot of fighting and stuff like that. So that's just an interesting question. That yes, it seemed like physically some of the Neanderthals were short, but they were very stocky and strong. So that stockiness and strength kind of made a massive difference for how they handled situations until the humans start fighting a little different. So most likely Cain was the stronger of the brothers, and his family was probably very powerful because his family kept talking about they're the ones that were killing people. Because remember, Cain's later descendant said that he killed someone. So we don't really see a lot of that from the early lines of Seth, but we did see a lot of that from the early lines of Cain. So that's going to be something to kind of take note in. So that means that there was evidence of battling. So that matches also with the Bible. So that's very important, that matches with the Bible, the fighting that had happened. So these groups were fighting with these groups. So these groups could have been there at the same time with their other sons and daughters, right? Because remember, he also had other sons and daughters. So these groups could have easily been fighting with these groups at that time. All that would have been pre-flood. So before the flood, these groups would have been going at it, mixing, interchanging. Maybe some of these ones getting with one of their sons. Because remember, each one of these had other sons and daughters. Each and every one of these had other sons and daughters based on the biblical narrative, right? Just to point that out real fast, because that is quickly understood. I don't know why. I think I closed our little book that we had open. I'll just open it up. Go to Genesis 9 and 1 right here, because this is where the earth gets filled. Now notice that we haven't yet talked about Ham, Shem, and Japheth, but we got a whole lot of people that we got to account for. We got a whole fleet of people before Noah that we have to account for logically, right? Right before the events of the giant catastrophic bottleneck. That's going to be very massive and important to know about, right? So that's going to be important to know. So what will happen is evidence of all these lines interchanging, mixing, getting together with this one and that one. And all of a sudden they start fighting and battling and the world gets worse. And apparently angels come. So it's all bad. At that time, it's all bad, right? Whether people believe it's angels or not, no matter what, these groups were mixing and things were getting very bad for them. So by the time of Noah, when the earth was filled with people, you're going to see a massive change of what line is dominant on the earth. So a new line should be dominant around after a Neolithic bottleneck. So a new line should start being dominant. And that's what's interesting, that after the older and youngest Dryas, there are no Neanderthals or Denisovans, which is at the bottleneck. And that's what we're going to talk about real fast. So let's get diving a little more into that. So I see whenever I close this tab, it closes. So I'm going to make sure I point this out on here. Make sure I point this out because I think it's important. This last piece here. All right. So massive events that happen. Now I'm going to point out the bottleneck. So let me first give out some information about the information on this bottleneck and why it's important, why to know about this bottleneck and whatnot. Because it's going to cause certain lines that are going to be related and certain lines that are not going to be related. So I'm going to click something here or try it again. All right, see if that opens up real fast. All right. So this is just some information on a highlight that I'm going to leave alone. That's not what I wanted to click. But let me read something here about this bottleneck. So remember, after the older and younger Dryas, there's evidence not just humans, but after like the younger and older Dryas, where the Natufian pops up and stuff, right? It says about 12,000 years ago, the Great Ice Age led to a mass extinction during which 75% of the Earth's mammal species were lost. So that's very important. That was a massive extinction. That's also evident on the genetic lines of humans and animals at the same time. All these things happen at the same time. There's going to be what's called a genetic bottleneck, right? It's going to be a small genetic diversity, and then that bottleneck happens. That basically makes it small. Basically, it will be a large group, a lot like the whole world will be a large group. All of a sudden, a catastrophic event happens, and then there's a small group after that bottleneck. That's why they call it a bottleneck. Just like how you turn let's say you fill the bottle with water, you turn it upside down. All the water doesn't come out at once because there's a bottleneck, right? So that's what's important. That's what it talks about. Like it changes the large diversity to a smaller diversity because of that bottleneck. Now let me point out something that's important to know real fast. I'm going to point out some facts that's important to know. Remember how we said that Noah would be a farmer and he would introduce farming and a lot of different things of that. I'm just going to read you an interesting highlight from this little piece of information. It says, but the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, as it is known, has been something of a puzzle since its discovery in 2015. This is because it was only observed on the genes on the Y chromosome that get passed down from father to son, which means it only affected men. Now, that's important because we had talked about it before, the massive extension or growth of females because of few men, getting with different females, because during that time, during the Neolithic time, it's proven that there were 17 women, almost 16 women, 17 women to one man. And that's what made the population bloom so fast. That's what made it bloom so fast. We'll go into that a little bit. It says, so most surprisingly to us, we detect another male-specific bottleneck during the period of global growth. Didn't Genesis say that the sons of Noah was going to fill the whole earth? And it tells you that after the bottleneck, when global growth, when the whole earth was being filled, it was being filled by the only group that came out of the bottleneck, right? So there's going to be evidence of a catastrophic wipeout, leaving a small genetic diversity. The signal for this bottleneck dates to a time period of 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, right? When, watch what it says, when humans in different parts of the world had become sedentary farmers. So it's saying that it happened when they were becoming farmers. Why is that important? Let me open up this little thing real fast and point out something. So remember Noah's wine country, the origin of human and wine migration. So 2020, a little interesting study that this person brings out. He brings out some interesting information that the biblical narrative points out, right? So he talks about the different things that we know, grape seeds and certain parts of the fashion of wine and everything. This is what we actually find. So we find obviously movements of ancient grapes moving all across the world and everything during that time. Remember, we was talking about that time of that bottleneck. So on their scale, after the Younger and Older Dryas and everything, during their said after the Younger and Older Dryas, after the bottleneck, the flood and all that, when the water rose 400 feet, did I point that out already? So again, so we're talking about the bottleneck that's going to happen in that time. We're going to also point out the genetics in those groups, but let me go up real fast and point out something of this that I think is important to find and point out. All right, so what happened was, let me just tell you what happened. Remember, the water was 400 feet lower. What happened was, as it says right here, over geologic time, sea level has fluctuated by more than 300 meters, probably more than 400 meters, right? Probably more than 400 meters, right? Why is that important, right? Because remember, we talked about how the world long time ago, the sea level was less than 400 feet, right? And that's why we had talked about how that was a catastrophic event that caused these things to change, right? Catastrophic event that caused these things to change, right? That's something that is very important that we have talked about. I'll just show you a quick sample of
There's an old
this
saying
scientist talking about it.
in human history that says, what we don't learn from our experiences, we are bound to repeat. Very important about this is if we don't have some experiences that we're aware of, then obviously we have knowledge that we're not going to be able to use. And I say there's some very important new knowledge about evolution that has come into our world in recent times. Historically, according to Darwinian theory, life has just been a continual, gradual evolution over billions of years, slight, imperceptible changes, but one continuous process. However, we now recognize that life was profoundly altered 5 times in the past by what are called mass extinctions. Mass extinctions occur when some cataclysmic event happens that wipes out up to 70 to 95% of all life on this planet. This has already happened 5 times. And Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould have created what is called the punctuated equilibrium theory to reveal that no, life is not one continuous progression of evolution, that there are start and stop points that have already happened 5 different times. What created these 5 mass extinctions? Well, natural such as massive tectonic plate movements, super large numbers of volcanoes going off at the same time, or objects from space such as comets or asteroids having an impact on this planet and upending the ecosystem. As we're witnessing today, there's an abrupt change in climate that's affecting life on this planet. But this is not the first in one day. Highest period. I said, well, when the last upheaval of climate occurred, it's referred to in science as the Younger Dryas period. I said, well, what happened? Well, if you look at the temperature charts, the temperatures were relatively cold. It was a very cold period on this planet, lots of ice all over the place. In fact, North America was essentially covered with ice. And I said, then what happened? Almost instantly, according to our record, which could have been even in one day, an event happened that raised the temperature so high that the ice started to melt. And the massive amount of ice melting led to the rising of the seas. 400 feet of rise in sea level. Well, 400 feet of rise in sea level. And the massive amount of ice melting led to the rising of the seas. 400 feet of rise in sea level.
So remember how we pointed out how the water was 400 feet lower in the post flood world, and then all of a sudden after the flood, the water is evidently 400 feet higher now. That means that all of a sudden after that event, that was not just a catastrophic bottleneck that happened at a time, right? I'm talking scientifically, like that was a catastrophic bottleneck that happened at that time, and that bottleneck, right, actually shows mass extinctions. For example, let me show you an example of some highlights from some of the facts of the Younger Dryas impacts and whatnot, and a couple different evidences of it. They talk about there was extinctions. They talk about there's a lot of different things. They have a lot of different research papers on those extinctions, right? They have pretty much massive extinctions worldwide, right? We're talking massive extinctions, massive destructions that was happening all over. And not just that, the fact that we're not just talking about Y chromosome of one species, we're talking about many different species worldwide vanished. So 400 feet of water rised, right? And it could have happened in one day.
Well, we're quite aware there was some massive event changed life on this planet 12,000 years ago. There are several theories trying to accommodate how this occurred.
So very, very important to understand the true scientific understanding to how these events happen, right? Now that flood, now you probably are wondering, well, if that flood happened, it probably also disturbed some other things. This is why it's very hard to date stuff at times, because water causes massive layering, and those layers can throw things off, right? If something happened within 20 minutes, we can show a demonstration of how water, if the water is strong enough in 20 minutes, it can show the evidence of what is seen after millions of years of layering, right? Of said uniform layering, right? We can find that evidence, and we can talk about that because we have that. But this is what's important, is that it connects the Younger Dryas, connects with the bottleneck that happened, right? So the Younger Dryas event also connects with the bottleneck, the massive extinction that happens at that time, right? So we have talked about those things that are very important to understand. And then we talked about how after that flood event, it would cause a lot of stress, and that stress causes females to produce more women. That's a real thing. That's a real thing to know about, that we have pointed out. And that's the reason why, is because, let me just point this quickly out. Since I don't need this, I'll just use it here. Oops. The Olympic all weird. Let that load in real fast, if it will. All right, so I'll point something out on here and on here as well. But I want to open up something and kind of show something that isn't kind of important that I think we could talk about. But before I go over that, this is just something to know about, right? Stress mothers have more girls, right? A lot more girls. So that's something to know about. We had talked about this before. I'm just gonna go to something. To point this out real fast. If you never heard of this, this is what happened during the Neolithic time frame. It is evident. Remember that same time frame, 8,000 years ago. Say 8,000 years ago, they found out that around that time there were 17 women, right, reproduced for every one man. What would that mean, right? If one man has 17 women and he gets them all pregnant, they would have 17 babies. That can expand the generation very quickly and fast, right? So 17 babies 1 year, right? They can have that many as much as they want. And then remember, they also lived a long time and they were very healthy, right? So they'll live at least a good 100 years, right? No doubt, and some. But this is something. What we were just talking about this time frame. Then when that guy, remember, he said that between that time frame and the advancement after the Younger Dryas events, and it says as it goes on, it talks about how humans spread across the globe, right? Across the globe, for every 17 women who were reproducing, passing on genes that are still around today. Only one man did at the time. So you hear what's going on here? After the Neolithic time frame, there was a lot of women, because of all that stress after the flood, and they kept bringing a lot of different sons and daughters, but mostly daughters. A lot of daughters that were produced at that time, right? So that's gonna be something that's important to note, and that's why you note here the bottleneck, right? Getting back to that right here, we had talked about this before. We had talked about this exact thing before. After the Younger Dryas extinction event, there was a massive bottleneck, right? Academically wise, there was a massive bottleneck, and that bottleneck is why we will have every single person today would show that they would come from a type of Noah. And we're going to point it out genetically. What is that type of Noah? Just to kind of make it understood. So they talk about the Y chromosomes and everything, right? This is what we was talking about a little earlier, whatnot. So let me get back over here. Let me close some of this. So that's some meat that goes with all of this. So let's go back over here and paint what's going on here. So this will be this time frame. Now we're gonna also put like what time frame it is biblically wise, right? If we say this one biblically wise, you will say technically like 4,000 BC, right? Something like that, right? And the flood would happen 1,500 years after that, right? Something like that, almost 2,000 years after that. And something like around 2,000 to 3,000 BC. Like I'm not gonna put a direct number on it, but by this time frame, it'll be like 2,000 to 3,000 BC. But that's if you are counting genealogies. Now, this is what you got to be careful on counting genealogies in the Bible. You got to ask yourself a question, right? Do you have every single information of every single person? Now, if we calculate from us to Adam, it would look like it's been only 6,000 years, because that right there going back 6,000 years, right? It will look about 6,000 years. And obviously these are round numbers, right? These are given round numbers, right? Now, with that said, the reason why that's important that I'm saying that is that when you look at the understanding of the science on how these years are calculated, you'll first come to an understanding to how they are calculated. There's a couple different problems in calculation methods, right? If you already know about the carbon dating, right, be careful on that. There's a lot of problems with carbon dating. Radiometric dating, right? Also, there's some problems with that, because we had talked about the layers, on how those layers can be laid down by floodwaters. And we had talked about that before, on how the floodwaters can lay down things that look like millions of billions of years. We also talked about different professionals that would tell you that even in the Middle East, there's no doubt that you got to question those years, right? Like the tree rings grow different in the Middle East and things like that. It's a couple different things. So we're going to put academic years on this, just so that if you was to compare on academic years, what it would look like. So this extinction right here will be between 40 to, you would say, about 10,000 BC. That's what it would look like. It would look something like this. But K, so it's 40,000 to 10,000 BC, right? K, right? 1,000. That's just gonna give a little understanding for how these work, right? That's what just KYA, right? I could just put KYA, right? Thousands of years before present. But we'll just put it like that, just to kind of get an understanding. Those events happen here, but how early does Adam's events happen? How early? On the scientific scale, is millions of years. On the scientific scale, if you want to find Adam, you got to look at millions of years ago. You got to look at millions of years ago to find Adam and Eve. If you're looking at thousands of years ago, you're not looking at the genetic ancient nodes of Adam. So based on the scientific scale, it's going to be at least millions of years. Now, when I'm saying that, I'm saying in a sense of that, remember, it's going to split from ancient humanoids that's going to be wiped out, right? Let me just show you again what I mean by that scientifically, because I know it may first sound like a shock for that large amount of scale of years, but it would make sense when you're looking at how these things are scaled and how these things are calculated. It's about finding the evidence of it. So I'm gonna show that real fast right here. Is how these groups are combined, right? So we're going to talk about that next time. We'll go a little more into Ham, Shem, and Japheth, but today we'll just verify until Ham, Shem, and Japheth, that division that's going to happen here. They'll rise up very early. Now they're mute. Now what's important is when we're looking for Ham, Shem, and Japheth, that's one thing. That doesn't mean that Ham, Shem, and Japheth themselves are going to have an exact different snip, but it would mean that they would come from a node, from one individual. That should show that they're all related. We'll point that out as we get there. Not go too fast so we can make sure we verify these things in a surety. So let me make sure I pull this one up real fast from here. One of these ones. I'll just switch over because I need a note that I think I switched from. So I'm gonna grab that if I could. All right, right here. All right, so even right here, from this first source, watch what it says here. Facial bones dating back 1.4 million years are the oldest human fossils ever on Earth on the European continent and could end up challenging the book of human prehistory according to the scientists involved in the landmark find. When was this? This is recent. This is just a recent find that this person is talking about. It's September 2022, and he's talking about a very interesting find that was found. He says archaeologists hail find as breakthrough that adds some 1 million years to the history of human habitation of Europe. So it just goes on to that. Now, obviously, where would Adam exist? Probably he'd be a Eurasian, right? He would probably be an area of Eurasia. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be no groups in Africa at that time either, but he would probably be early in the areas of Eurasia, close to Spain, even by areas of Mesopotamia, right? Because remember, Adam was kicked out of Eden. So that doesn't mean that he had to remain in Euphrates. Doesn't mean that his descendants have to grow in the area of Euphrates. They could have grew anywhere after leaving the area of Euphrates. Now, because the rivers were by Ethiopia, right? Remember, there was 4 heads of those rivers. There was Ethiopia, there was Tigris, Euphrates, whatnot, one of the Indus River, right? And those was a place where people started. But we know that early humans would start around areas of Eurasia. Why is that important? Because we've been talking about how, guess what? It does not go with the outer Africa concept. The interesting thing is the natural scientific understanding of where humans began and how humans developed doesn't work. The evolutionary outer Africa concept doesn't work for humans. The more you look at the actual papers, you'll realize that the outer Africa concept doesn't work for humans. But the biblical concept of humans, one, starting off and filling the whole world, and then all of a sudden going through a bottleneck and starting off from Eurasia again, and it's filling the whole earth, right? Going down into Africa, filling the whole earth, bringing the animals with them, because that's one of the biggest things too. All the animals went extinct. All the animals after this event, after the Neolithic bottleneck, guess what you'll find out? All the animals migrated to Africa. Did I also mention that there's evidence after that time frame in the Neolithic, every animal in Africa migrated. So that's something to know about these events, that there's evidence of animals migrating, right? So that's important to understand. So this is just something that's important to know, that just goes over those things and where they came from and where they moved. And that's where pretty much where people moved from. And they have what's called a Paleolithic paradise. So it's like a lot of people were basically around Mesopotamia or all those places like that, settled around these ancient places until that bottleneck happened. Until that bottleneck in the Neolithic time frame happens, and then there's extinction. Now you're probably wondering, well, some of the groups, some of the lineages that are of today seem like they probably existed before the Neolithic bottleneck. Of course, because Cain, this is what's interesting about Cain. Cain would still come from Adam. So that's important. So that means that he can easily have the same mutations as us today. So that means that a line that can exist then that looks like it's related to us, but when extinct, could still be considered an ancient human, because a lot of ancient humans have certain lineages that we see today. But all the lineages that we see today would lead to Eurasian split, which is actually a little deeper than the lines of many groups today. It's an ancient line, right? Just to point it out. It's actually going to split at a group that makes everything from C to T. They call it CT, or CT dash M168, I believe it's called. Yeah, mutation M168. And this is actually going to be, as it says right here, the most common male line ancestor, right? TMRCA of all CT men today, right? It says predate the recent African origin of modern humans. What did it say that what it does? It predates. It predated it, because the out of Africa concept, the more they look at genetics, it doesn't support it. It says it predates the recent African origin of modern humans, a migration in which some of his descendants participated, right? He is therefore thought to have lived in Africa before this proposed migration, in keeping with the concept of Y chromosome Adam given to the, now this was interesting what we're seeing here. So they're saying keeping the concept of Y chromosomal Adam. It says this about CTM168. It says, has therefore also been referred to in popularized accounts as being the lineage of Eurasian Adam, or out of Africa Adam. You hear what it's saying there? So it's calling your CT Adam. Why? Because there's a major separation at CT. CT is going to be our Noah. We're going to also prove it and kind of point out how there's going to be lines that are separate, like CF, DE, and those A and B groups from the CT and BT groups. And these are the major E-M696 and F-M89. These are the major families that many deal with when they talk about the separations of Ham and Shem. So Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So these two are two major separations. These are going to be key for noting when we note a little later, right? So it's going to be very important. So it has a lot of different descendants. These are going to be SNPs. It's going to be important to know what's a node and what's a clade. So that's how we're going to be able to find out what's going on here between nodes and clades. So we're going to remember that, just take a visual note of it, and then we're going to return to it because it's going to be some key factors in that. So let's make sure first, before we proceed forth, there is a Eurasian Adam. So there's also in modern humans, what connects a lot of modern humans is A00. A00 connects a lot of modern humans. How do we know? Let me, before I even put that there, let me actually show what's going on there. I did a major study on A00, and we found the separation of those lines of how A00 is. A00 is considered a modern human, but there's a line directly right before it that's a separate line, A000, or A with 3 zeros, and A with 4 zeros, which is Denisovan. A with 3 zeros is Neanderthal, A with 4 zeros is Denisovan. But let me first point out something here. Let me go to it and point it out here so that we can take a look at this on this ancient division before we proceed to write this down. Because we're going to write down how these separate. Now we're going to find the evidence of Noah. So in between humans from Noah to Adam, we got to find humans that would exist before the Younger Dryas event. If you want to find humans that would be before Noah, right? So that's going to be kind of important to remember that anything that was before that 400 feet of rise of water would be pre-flood, right? But also in consideration of how to go about that, right? So let me make sure this thing pops open so I can go to the piece here. All right. It's just a long note, so you can see this thing's still sliding, so some stuff still loading in. All right. That looked like it finished. All right. Because then when we start looking at modern humans, we're going to look at a star graph. We got to look at a star graph because there was a major study on humans today, and it found out that all humans today come to a recent bottleneck. Not just the big atom, not just the ancient atom, but a recent atom, just like we seen CT, atom CT. All right, so here's where we're going to talk about that modern human. So we know that A00, we did find them in some slave families in North Carolina, right? Slave families, some groups that came from the slave movements, slave trade movements, right? So we know that was a modern human, and they were found a lot of different people. Now they did do a major deep study on it, and they found out that it goes very far back. But one of the major things that they did find out is how it separates from ancient humans, which let me actually point that out here. All right. So we know that A00 is 0% of the tree, but let me actually point out. All right. So remember we were talking about that so-called bottleneck after that global mass extinction, and then we talk about those ancient archaic humans. Now I'm going to show you what nodes are going to be the ones that survive the bottleneck, and I'm going to show you the nodes that are extinct past the bottleneck, and I'm going to use both of these to show that. So remember, I have to use two of these because one, I'm going to show you one with the mtDNA. So this right here is going to be involving the mtDNA. So this study right here is the study from the Dirt Cave. If you haven't seen it, I should probably point it out real fast. Here, I'll point out, this just came out literally 2021, I believe, or 2020, something around there. As you can see right here, 2021. Okay, so it says the unearthing Neanderthal population history using basically nuclear and mitochondrial DNA from cave settlements. So mitochondria. And what it did tell us is that all females today, though there's Neanderthals and Denisovans, just like we see right here, bring this right here, refresh that because I guess it closed. So we see right here, there's earlier half Neanderthal and Homo, I can't even say his name, Homo giganteus, I can't even say his name, but ancient humans with Denisovans and ancient humans with combinations of Neanderthals and everything, because Neanderthals and Denisovans mixed and all that stuff. So Neanderthals and Denisovans are actually those ancient pre-flood individuals. So that's going to be important. They exist. And then all of a sudden something happens, then there's a flood, and then everyone descends from these certain lines. There's going to be an event of groups coming from certain lines. That's going to be from mtDNA. So we know that there is a node of lines that were wiped out, right? El Sharon, and all those things, they were wiped out, and all modern humans will come from one node. Now, if we look at the Y DNA, right now, this is the Y DNA, we see exactly the same design. We see that there's a root that will lead you to your atom, but there's a separation from these ancient humans. There's El Sharon, right, with A000, because A with 3 zeros is a Neanderthal, which El Sharon is a Neanderthal. And A with 4 zeros is Denisovan, where there's Denisova, the Denisova caves, where they found Denisovans. And these lines are extinct. This one's extinct. This one's extinct. So that's a node. These dots, that's green dot, this blue dot, that's a node. And this red dot is modern humans. Everything that you see from here would be modern humans. There's a separation between A00. These A and B groups are different than everything under CT. BT and CT is the split. So BT and CT makes a separation. That's going to be very important. So as we see right here, there's CT, and BT right here will have other lines. So BT, but be careful on how you go about BT, because BT is not A1A or A1B, because there is a BT M19, which is not the root BT M42. BT M42 will be more deeper. You want to look at the deepest root, or the BT star, basal BT star, which is the root of some of the groups. That's something to also note on some of the things. But that one has a lot of information to note, right? But the one that you want to find is M42. That's the root of the roots of different divisions. M42, BT M42. Now, with that said, with that understanding said, the reason why I'm pointing that out, because it's this separation is Eurasian. Remember, CT Eurasian atom. That's what they call it. They call CT Eurasian atom, which was seen on a lot of different papers. So they have it on a couple different papers that they had that on, right? Different individual papers that would talk about how those will go about, of how CT actually would separate a couple different lines. So let's put that on there, and we're also going to prove it. So at this time frame, I'm also going to show you we got BT and CT at this time frame. So also let me show that real fast of those separations. We see the sons of BT and CT that will start existing in that time frame. Right? Just to kind of point that out, because that's going to be the bottleneck time frame, the time where the bottleneck starts to happen. And they call it the Paleolithic time frame. That's what they call it. Let me actually go down here and point it out right here. So here's just an example. Here's a F-M89 with a haplogroup mtDNA M, about 45,000 years ago. And that's when about the same time when Neanderthals were moving. So Neanderthals were interacting with modern humans, as we said. Modern humans would have been interacting with Neanderthals, because these all would have been snips of snips, family ties. Here's some cousins, here's some uncles. They're all related, right? But the nodes are going to make a difference. So remember, Cain's family is going to be a totally distant family from Seth's family, right? But they will be interacting at that time into the bottleneck that happens. And that's going to be basically all those lines go extinct. There's another Eurasian CT, right? A Eurasian CT where all lines come from, right? So that's going to be very, very important to know. It's going to be very, very important to take a note in. That's going to be how we're going to get an idea of what's going on with these lines if we put it to its academic form. So let's put that next to here. So modern humans with archaic humans. So archaic humans, with the A00s and all those things. I'm just going to put it on the side as a reminder. A00s. So remember, modern humans with A0s, this one, and with that BT CT split, because that's going to be key. These events are going to be key events. Now, it may looking at it side to side, it's like, well, how can these be lined up like that? The thing is, you got to take the Bible as the authoritative node factor. That means that the Bible is telling you the origin, but the sources, the modern sources, is going to be what we're finding by looking at the things. So we're finding a similar outcome, right? We already see that there was a Y chromosome, Adam and Eve, right? That makes many nodes and many clades. So we know that Adam and Eve makes many sons and daughters. And the main clade is Seth. That's going to lead to Noah. So there's going to be some main. And what's also interesting is that the main clade, I'm going to also point out here that modern humans, right? Modern humans is actually the main clade that survives. Modern humans is the main clade that survives here. So these survive, this one doesn't. So these ones right here do not survive. They go extinct. So these are going to go extinct, right? So just to kind of make that clear, is that Cain's line goes extinct, archaic humans go extinct. So that's very important. So we're going to note that Seth, his line lives, right? Seth's line lives. I'm going to make it color coordinated. Seth's line lives. So Seth line lives, Cain line doesn't. Modern humans live, archaic humans don't. So we're going to note that the extension after the massive flood event, we're going to see these super nodes that's going to make major clades. So that's what we're going to have to find, is that what clade would be able to make all humans today, that one, they have to be able to make each other, right? But not others. I'm going to show you a image, because I wanted to show this little review, but I guess I'm gonna do that another time, because I want to talk about his little review. I think what he said was very wise. I think there's more individuals that need to look at the book Trace to go into the depth of the stuff, because I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it's very beneficial to go into. But let me show you something. Let me show you an image here that I put here, and I'll just tell you a story to the image. You see this little image here? Don't this kind of look familiar? Who designed it? Who design looks like this? If you've ever seen Answers in Genesis, the guy who's doing the Trace series, right? Dr. Nathan Jensen, when he first brought out how these monophylactics split, guess what he did in one of his few early designs? He showed the actual real monophylactic split, where the split is at the YAP negative CF and at the YAP plus allele DE and at the YAP negative A and B groups. That's what this picture actually is. It's actually a picture of how these groups actually properly split. And I'm going to show you how they properly split unbiasedly, and we can also verify it genetically. So first, as always, we always go to geneticists and get a double or second opinion from them to verify the sources that we already have published, to look at what's going on with these things and whatnot, because it's going to give us a major understanding of what's happening here. So one of the biggest things is, let me first point this out. The definition that I mentioned has to be known, right? It's one of my rules in understanding of stuff. You got to know what monophylactic means. What does it mean to be monophylactic? It's a Greek word. Mono, just remember, mono, anything that's mono is one. So mono is a single. So, mono, I can't think of something like that. I'm not gonna think of it. Monophylactic, mono, one, phylactic, family. And it's a Greek word. So monophylactic basically means it's basically talk about, remember how I was talking about clades early on? It's a clade. So sometimes called a clade, right? Includes an ancestral taxon and all his descendants, pretty much. Just talk about the node, right? A monophylactic group can be separate from the root with a single cut, right? Whereas non-monophylactic groups needs two or more, right? Another way to understand monophylactics is common descent, right? Another way to understand monophylactics is common descent. So common descent is a concept in quote unquote evolutionary biological, right? Biology, pretty much. When one species is the ancestor of two or more species later in time. So common descent is a monophylactic family. Common descent is a monophylactic group. So that's what it means to be monophylactic, right? Because we're going to note this as we point out some things. So it says all living beings are in fact descendants of a unique ancestor commonly referred to as the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth, according to modern evolutionary biology, right? So it just goes on and it lets us know about the monophylactics. It says, this is what's important. I'm going to point out this especially. So this is what we need to know about monophylactic. Of a group of organisms descended from a common evolutionary ancestor or ancestral group, right? That's why monophylactic is important, especially one not shared with any other group. Now, what does that mean? Let me just show you what I mean. I'm going to show you a monophylactic question that I asked and verified that for the sake of knowing this information. This is what I asked them, because IJK is an ignored haplogroup, but verifying its link tells us what everyone actually is. So I asked them this. Yes, then it's correct to say F-M89 is a grandfather of IJK, but not A and B nor D and E. Now what I just did, I separated the three families, A and B, D and E, the DE YAP groups, because remember from that little image that I was showing a little earlier.
I just want to make this live to demonstrate how these notes are.
Pause this. Right, but you see this little image right here? This little image, this YAP negative, YAP plus, and YAP negative. That's A and B, that's DE, and that's CF. What's important about that is that matches the understanding of the scientific understanding, the actual real academically correct separation of these lines. So we know F-M89 makes all groups like IJK, but it doesn't make A and B nor D and E, right? That's very important. The reason why that's important, not just is that important for the sake of like when I'm gonna do a video when this guy did a review on the book called Trace, because a lot of times Trace doesn't really touch on a lot of ancient finds, and this other guy also picks that up. They touch a lot of ancient finds, because then you'll start seeing these ancient nodes. Because what's interesting about a node is your great great grandfather doesn't live today. So to find your great 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 grandfather, you have to look in ancient burials, right? You can't look at someone today to find your ancient grandfather. So that's what you got to be careful on. Like that's what some testers do. They'll look at modern people to determine where they were a long time ago, right? That's not how like real origins work. But what's interesting about the monophylactic group, if F-M89 makes one whole family, and then A and B makes a whole family, and D and E makes a whole family, then we have without a doubt, 100% academically, we can show that not only does F-M89 make its own family, but it just like Japheth cannot make Ham or Shem, we just completely found the origin of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, because A and B cannot make D and E cannot make F. So that means that these are three different families in its total. But you got to be careful on A groups, because there's some misinformation on A groups. So let me quickly clarify that on the split of BT before we put this on the chart. So while this thing loads, as you see, everything so far is in uniformity. And when I say uniformity, I'm saying academically correct. And we can also show, like we had went over before, that from the very creation, from the beginning, from time, space, and matter, that the Bible gives the exact order to when those things were created. When I say when those things, on their order of creation, it's like water came first, right? You need water for the development of life. Then fish came, right? Birds and all those things. Then mammals were made later, right? That's also the understanding of the biblical narrative, but that's a little earlier. So we're just focusing on Adam's time. So let's first pinpoint an understanding of how BT and CT actually works. So this is going to be geneticist breaking down the real split of BT and CT, which also is called alpha and beta. So there's your alpha and your beta. So your alpha node and your beta node would be basically the ultimate nodes of modern people today. So that would be BT and CT. That's why they say right here that the tree shows the alpha haplogroup, which is the ancestral haplogroup of the African and non-African haplogroups, and the beta haplogroup, which is the ancestral group close to the close or identical with BT in the current classification. What's really saying is because BT and CT are very similar. They're identical. BT and CT is like a split. That's all it is, ancestral split. But it makes these different lineages, right? It makes your A groups, and it makes your F through R groups, which are one family, F-M89, F through R, underneath one node. Those will be representative of your Europoid or Caucasoid groups. Also, your haplogroup B, right? But B actually is linked with A. B and A are very, very highly linked. C also is linked with F. So CF actually is a early root. CF dash P143. We'll point that out. CF dash P143 is an ultimate root. That's why I was pointing out CF on that thing, right? Right on this. Is actually on this side is CF, really. That's what it is CF, to be more clear on that. But let me go back over here. So CF is one family. So C and F will go together. And also DE is another family. As it says right here, the Middle Eastern haplogroups D and E split 42,000 years ago. So D and E, the YAP groups will be one. So these are actually three nodes, but you have to be careful on how BT works, right? We already went over how none of A1 or AB or none of those A groups, right? Not even A0, A0A and all those A groups. None of those A groups and none of BT or CT lineages descend from them, because you got to know the real way that they descend. So you got to know that and make sure this chord is in. And we went over the whole process of it, how they 100% know that the real mutation rate of these groups, BT, let's go back over here. BT is a root. So that means that from BT, right, for these lines, what we would get is we're going to get from him, from Shem, I'll just put that like that, and from Japheth, right? You're going to get a major separation. So I'm just going to put it like that. And then we'll just put those three lines. Let's put those three lines here. And those three lines would be your A and B, your DE, and DE is YAP plus. Now it doesn't sound like it's important to know that, but it's actually very important genetically wise, because only one group is YAP plus. So DE is YAP plus, and so A and B is actually YAP negative. That means that it doesn't come from the YAP groups. That's very important to not mix the A and B and the D and E groups up. And there's also your CF-P143. That's going to make your F-M89. So let's put that. That's your C star and F-M89, which is YAP negative. So YAP negative. So only one group is YAP plus. This one would be one other group. So remember, this one doesn't make this one, and this one doesn't make this one, and this one doesn't make this one, because they all split from CT. So this one would split. You know, you would have your, just put it here. You will have your BT and your CT look groups, just to kind of make it understood. So this is actually where they would come from. They would come from BT and CT's divisions. That means that early lines from Seth to here, they would have an in between of A00. That means that early groups could have had some lines of early humans of A00. So early humans could have had A00 or had other lines of the like. They could have BT, CT, or A00. Early humans could have had that line. And then that could have easily, as they had sons, they could have got a mutation. So that means even Cain line can have like a J or stuff like that. They can have early J's in the lands of Caucasus or something like that. They can have early lines like that. But that doesn't mean, let me make sure I quote this, that doesn't mean that all lines today or any line today would be from Cain, right? Because they would be wiped out. But it just means that Cain can get that mutation. That means some of his rare sons could pick up that mutation, but they would go extinct. That means that the ones that will come later after the Neolithic bottleneck, BT and CT, those will be the groups that actually would show ties of making all modern humans today. These all don't make each other. So, and we also see that evidently in the scientific method. So this is actually right here is when we can start bringing the modern human genetics to the science. So this right here would actually be the consideration here. So what will come after this, after these events, right? There'll be after the bottleneck. So remember, there's a bottleneck that happens here. So that's going to be very important. After the bottleneck, there's going to be the event of where they increase. So they're going to the population increases, and this is actually the line that increased. So there's going to be a bottleneck with these lines after the flood. And remember, the flood, it's a process, a whole year process. So it's raining, the weather is going to fluctuations, ice is melting, Earth's shooting out lava because the Earth's cracking open, right? So there's water that's shooting out of the Earth, there's lava that's bursting out of certain places, and there's all types of smoke that's going in the air because the Earth is open. So there's large catastrophic events that's happening, Earth shaking, all types of stuff. The moon's becoming black, everything's becoming crazy at that time. That's important to know because all those events will happen because the rain, thick clouds of rain raining down, water shooting out, Earth's cracking open, all those things are going to be cause an effect of the extinction of these individuals. Very important. So who knows? There could have been comets flying out of the sky. Who knows what all could happen? Stars could have been falling, the skies and skyfall. When I say stars, comets and stuff, meteors and whatnot. All types of stuff could have been happening at that time, right? It's like a time of wrath, right? It's all types of stuff happening. It never rained before that day. So there's the evidence of the bottleneck happens, especially the younger Dryas and older Dryas, right? That's going to be one of those things. So we can put the older and younger Dryas. And we'll just say, so that's very important. So at this time, there was a catastrophic flood. So everything that would be before Noah would be pre-flood. So that would be pre-flood. Everything that would be pre-flood would be pre-flood individuals that would exist and everything. But Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who, remember, they existed before the flood and after the flood. So they would have family before the flood and after the flood. So hopefully this will not too difficult to understand. You can see the highlight is counting Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and this is what they will become, their lineages. Just like a Hamite can make a Shemite, and a Shemite can make a Japhethite, A and B, Yap negative can make Yap plus, nor CF, Yap negative make A and B, right? Even though these are both Yap negative, but they're separated by CT. So that's gonna be the root. The node is CT. The node is CT. That separates this one, and BT that separates these ones. So they're separate. And what would lead them to like common connections of humans is probably A00. And A00, all that A00 is just evidence of a SNP that has every mutation. Because remember, you're going from a perfect man to these mutations later on. So they call it evolution, but evolution is pretty much impossible because we would not find evidence of something that would make a perfect man like A00. When I say a perfect man, you can study on A00. It has almost every snip in it. There's no scientific process to get that. Rather, it had to be that this individual had every snip. At first, a perfect individual with all the snips and mutations, and all of a sudden, he gets those mutations, start losing a lot of information, right? And that's what we would see. Rather, evolution, we see degradation or mutations, right? As humans get more and more weaker, they will lose more and more. So very, very important. So we have indeed a catastrophic event that these will all match up with, and we will have these same families that would basically be all modern people today are. All modern people today are from either A and B, D and E, or CF, not from the ancient humans, not from A00. They're not from Neanderthals, Denisovans, or any of the previous ancient humans before. Think about that. If this earth has supposedly millions and hundreds and billions of other humanoids that existed before we got here, why is it that none of them exist today? Because that was a catastrophic wipeout event that every single one of their different human species, ancient humans, right, all these archaic humans vanished after a catastrophic bottleneck event. So that's very important to know. All right, so let's sum it up. So we're going to stop right about here. And the next time we go over here, we're going to talk about Babel. So next time, we're going to bring the evidence of Babel and linguistic ties. So that's going to be languages. So that's going to be pre-Indo-European, pre-Semitic. So we're going to talk about some Sumerians, no doubt. So we're going to be talking about Sumerians and cultures before them. Because that time frame that I'm showing you right here, we're going to have to now look at time frames between times from, we'll say, 10,000 K to 8,000. Right. This is what we're going to have to look at for stuff that's pre-Babel. And now you're probably wondering, like, why so high? It's going to be a reason. There's going to be a reason why, to look at what's going on here. And then we're going to start getting to what happens after Babel, when languages start dividing and they start getting languages and everything. But we got to look about 8,000, 10,000 K to 8,000, and then we're going to proceed from there to get what's going to happen there. So, and remember, Babel is also very historic. So the rising up a place before Babylon, because remember, Babylon rises up with the Amorites and the Kassites. So that's the first Babylon ever. I'm talking BC, 2000 BC Babylon, not like Neo-Babylon. I'm talking Proto-Babylon, which is right after Babel. So that nation is going to exist after the ancient Babel falls. So we're going to look at some of those things in ancient finds. Because at this time frame, just to visually show this, we got some information we're going to talk about. But let me just visually show the next thing we're going to get into, some details later on, just to go into the Sumerians. And how long ago were the Sumerians? How long ago did they exist? All right, they exist a long time ago. But there's also the land of Cush and stuff that exists there and whatnot. But this is actually going to be a little after, right? This is late Neolithic. We got to look at the early Neolithic. There's something a little earlier and a little more interesting that happens at its origins that we're going to kind of get into and whatnot before they come together as a Sumeria and whatnot. Sumer. There's going to be some things that's going to happen before the rise of Mesopotamian cultures and whatnot. So we'll get into some of that and some of those things because it's going to be kind of interesting. But it's, what's the word I'm looking for? You'll understand when we get there. So it's going to go from there, and then we're going to go after Babel, because remember, there's something that happens in the midst of Babel and something that happens after Babel. It's going to be very, very important to note, and it's going to match with the genetics. So let's quickly, before we do a summary, let's make sure everything's good. All right, let's do a summary of what we did today. So what did we do today? We took the information from the Bible, and we took the information from like sources, from academic work, and from the world, to get like an understanding on how the creation is. And we notice these similarities. I'm going to use this purple one to make the similarities. So we know that biblically there's an Adam and Eve. We also know academically and scientifically there's a Y chromosome Adam and there's a Y chromosome Eve. It's important to know that on the biblical narrative that was stretched back 6,000 years. I think that the biblical narrative is talking about nodes. Now, those years in those nodes, we actually did a video, the first video on Synthetic Sunday shows that it's actually probably talk about a genetic curve. If you don't know what a genetic curve is, you should check out. I'll put the playlist in the description, but I'll just show you what it is real fast. What's a genetic curve? A genetic curve is calculating the years of their descendants and stuff, and how old is even weird to kind of to quickly summarize it. I'll just show you what it is. If you ever see this video, this is on the Synthetic Sunday playlist, right? I'll put this in the description. It's right. It's the last playlist, so right here on the Synthetic Sunday playlist. Even if you just click it, that the first thing that plays is the introduction video, and the introduction video goes over what's up with these years and all those things and whatnot, and what the biblical narrative is actually talking about. So you can see right here, it basically goes over what is a scientific genetic curve, what is actually a scientific genetic curve. You want, I'm not gonna do a summary on it because it requires too much information to do a summary on it, but just know that there's a scientific understanding to those years in the Bible. So that's what this is. It actually goes over in detail. If you want a more detailed video on Ham, Shem, and Japheth, Ham 4 sons, Shem's 5 sons, and Japheth's 7 sons, you can look at this video. It goes even more detail into what we just went over today. So back over here. So the ancient Adam, ancient Adam and Eve, by the academic papers, was stretched a million years ago, like millions of years ago, right? By said their time frame. But we know that the ancient Adam and Eve does make nodes and clades, which are actually sons and daughters. So that's very important. So nodes and clades are actually sons and daughters. So we know Adam and Eve were making individuals. The biblical narrative focused on an individual called Seth. Seth brings forth individuals who are going to be known as pretty much descendants later on of Noah. So Seth is going to bring forth the family of Noah. But there's also another family, a clade, that makes other individuals. They're going to be pre-flood individuals, Cain. There's also individuals who are going to be known as being wiped out on the academic side called archaic humans. All those archaic humans, or those ancient humans, are wiped out, where we're talking A with 3 zeros, A with 4 zeros for Denisovan, and A with 3 zeros for Neanderthal, or those mtDNAs of the females. Those are all wiped out. Every single one of them are wiped out. So just like Cain's line is wiped out, Abel and all that, they're wiped out. Just like we know with the biblical narrative, archaic humans have the same evidence of a massive extinction, a massive wipeout. But there's a scientific name called modern humans. All modern humans would have an equal understanding as Ham, the sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth from Noah. It would be from a Eurasian clade called CT. So modern humans, with the separation from those A00 groups with BT and CT, making all humans today, including A and B, D and E, and CF, those lines during a event called, they call it between the older and younger Dryas, the massive extinction that happens and the global bottleneck that takes place, that event leaves behind evidence that there was not only a bottleneck on a global scale on human beings, but also on animals. So animals and humans, just like how the Bible says, at the exact same time, the Bible says that there was a mass extinction of animals and humans. And that's what we see at the Neolithic time frame and the beginning of the spreading of farming. We start to see a massive bottleneck that happens. So the time frame where this transition is actually going to be called the Neolithic. So the Neolithic is actually going to be the time that we're going to point to. So the Neolithic transition, I'll just leave that right there for now so we don't, because I got to remove all these purples anyway. So the Neolithic transition is actually going to be where we're going to note this. We can also notice that just from this year frame right here, where that's all going to change, right? So there's going to be a major change that's going to happen during the time of Babel. And that's when we're going to start to see that around scientifically 4000 BC, we're going to see languages start to grow. So we're going to go from 8000 to 4000 BC for the development of the different languages that pop up. It's going to be kind of interesting to go into the ancient roots. And languages do have a ultimate root origin. We'll talk about it a little later. I got a little note for it. And we're going to talk about how these languages had an early tie. And it's going to go all the way to the divisions of Sumerians and early groups like that. Because the Sumerians actually reached all the way to South America. So we'll talk about some interesting things like that. So what did we find today? We found out just from academic papers. If we was to look at things academically in a sense of comparison, right? Sensible comparison, we can see that there is evidence of a massive extinction and a massive global replacement for the evidence from descendants of Adam to Noah. Because remember, if the New Testament describes Noah as if he was a real event, right? Because it talks about Noah and Adam like they're real individuals. That means that they must also be evident, which I would say academically, biblically wise, there is enough evidence to show that we should take the Bible as a very serious source that may even be describing the evidence of creation. So with that, family, for now, I hope that was something as a nice introduction for what we're going to do next. And we'll go into some of the information. Before we dive into the information, remember I said 8,000 years ago? So right here. So we're going to start at 8,000 years ago, and we're going to work to 4,000 years. So I'll show you what happened after Noah and his sons and how they got with all those women and had all those things happen and whatnot, and how they spread and a couple different things. So 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, we're going to go into those things, which also is the time of Noah. And we just point out that 8,000 years ago, with the time of Noah, this was actually what this is talking about. Noah's wine country, the origin of human and wine migration. Remember, we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about how there is evidence from the areas of the mountains of Ararat, which we also point out that boat at Mount Judy, right? The ark is at Mount Judy. And we're going to point out how these things were taking place around 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, also 6,000, all those in-betweens, right? We're going to get into some things that's happening here and whatnot. But it's going to let you know how it's connected. It's going to be connected with the Bible, right? We at Genesis and Genetics consider carbon dating good science in principle, right? However, have not concluded as whatnot, right? Because remember, also, we're going to be using the what's the word I'm looking for? The scientific method. So we're going to be using the scientific method to find these things and prove the true movements and everything of all these things, whatnot. So it's going to be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Very interesting. It's going to be very, very interesting. So the next thing we're going to touch on is Noah and the movements of his sons. So Noah and the movements of his farming sons. So that's going to be something we're going to look at a little later. So with that, family, may you be blessed. May you be beloved. And amen, family.